evening and welcome. My name is Angela LaChica. I'm the Managing Director of the Players Coalition. I wanted to thank Venue SIX10 for hosting us this evening. The Players Coalition is a group of current and former professional athletes around the country who are using their platforms to impacting social justice issues on various levels. We've hosted these community forums across the country, and we're excited to be here tonight with the candidates here in Chicago. I'd like to make some player introductions real quick. First, we have Jason Burns, who is a Chicago native. He's the Executive Director of Metal Minds Foundation and former player for the Cincinnati Bengals. Next, we have Corey Mays, another Chicago native, former player for the Kansas City Chiefs and president of the NFL Alumni Chicago chapter. And then our moderator and our host for the evening, Vaughn Bryant. Vaughn is the Executive Director of Communities Partnering for Peace at Metropolitan Peace Initiatives and a former NFL player. Thank you, Vaughn.
Thank you for joining us tonight. Our justice system is broken. Mass incarceration, school-to-prison pipeline, cash bail, police misconduct continue to plague Cook County and the entire country. It is our most vulnerable and historically marginalized communities, often populated by Black and brown people, often people who live in poverty, who are most harmed by this broken system. More than any other government official, the elected state's attorney has the power to shape and change the criminal justice policy. Every day, the state's attorney makes decisions that have an enormous impact on the lives of Cook County residents. Who to charge, who to divert from the criminal justice system. They decide whether to seek retribution or rehabilitation. It is clear that the state's attorney's power, the power to prosecute and sentence, and the power to seek mercy and second chances comes with immense responsibility. Your votes will decide our next state's attorney. For that reason, we're pleased to have the opportunity to talk with the candidates who are seeking this office. Let's get started.
How's everybody tonight? Before we welcome our guests to the stage, there are a few ground rules we'd like to abide by. We are picked randomly to determine the order in which the candidates will deliver their opening statements and answer the initial questions. After the initial question, we will alternate who first answers each question. Mrs. Kim Fox will deliver the opening statement, followed by Bill Conway, and then Donna Moore. Welcome to all the candidates. We go down the line and hear a short opening statement from each of you, and then we'll have some questions. We hope this can be a productive and lively conversation about the role of state's attorney in ending mass incarceration. The candidates will have 2 minutes for an opening statement. The moderators will then ask questions. Each candidate will have 1 minute to respond. An organizational representative will be stationed at the front of the stage, keeping time visually. Yellow cards, a 30-second warning, red is for stop. We will enforce this time restriction so that we can move the night along. There will only be follow-ups if the moderator elects to ask a follow-up question. Finally, each candidate will have 2 minutes for a closing statement. We will reverse the order from the opening statements to give those closing statements. And at the end, we will have a few questions from the audience, time permitting. There are index cards on the chairs. Someone will come around and collect your questions, and we'll ask a few of these questions toward the end of the discussion. And now, please welcome the candidates, Kim Fox, Bill Conway, and Donna Moore to the stage.
You're good. Yeah. You're good. You guys, they're gonna go. They're gonna go now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Go for it.
Yep.
Thank you so much, Players Coalition, for hosting this event tonight. Thank all of you for joining us tonight. When I took office in 2016, the Cook County jail population was made up of 86% people of color. The Juvenile Temporary Detention Center has 92% children who are Black and brown. That is despite the fact that people of color are not the overwhelming representation of our county. The reality is also when I took office is that the overwhelming majority of people who were dying by homicide were African American men and women, followed by Latinos. And the reality is that we could not talk about the criminal justice system in Cook County without talking about race and the impact of a system over the history of its inception that has been built on institutional racist practices that have led to so many to be incarcerated, largely for low-level, nonviolent offenses. And so when I ran for office in 2016, I took a different approach. I talked about the fact that we had a criminal justice system that was in fact broken, that disproportionately impacted communities of color, and that we had to actively work for criminal justice reform while at the same time trying to achieve public safety. It is what was required. As someone who grew up in a tough neighborhood like Cabrini, who knew the impacts of the deprivation of resources to communities and what led to violence, we needed to look at the root causes of violence, stop needlessly incarcerating people for offenses that could be dealt with outside of the justice system, and put our resources to combating violent crime. And so I'm very proud of the fact that over the course of the last 3 years, that we have seen a reduction in the number of cases that have been prosecuted for nonviolent offenses. That in fact, the prison population in Illinois has gone down some 20% as a result of the prosecutorial choices that we've made in Cook County. They haven't always been popular. While now it's very popular to say that you're a progressive prosecutor and you believe in criminal justice reform, the moment that you stop prosecuting certain offenses, the moment you stop prosecuting people for driving on suspended licenses because they can't pay their tickets, the outrage comes. When you start advocating for bail reform, there will be those who will fearmonger and say that that's not right. When you work to right the wrongs of the past and vacating wrongful convictions, people will say, why are you doing that? We did that when it wasn't popular. We did that in the face of adversity. And we've been able to see the results of a shrinking criminal justice system and at the same time maintaining public safety for those who need it most in our neighborhoods.
My name's Bill Conway. I was born and raised here in Chicago. I am married and I have a 13-week-old baby daughter named Bella, who I don't get to spend nearly as much time with as I'd like. I was in the state's attorney's office from 2006 to 2012 and really had a wonderful experience there. Started off in misdemeanors, worked in traffic, worked in bond court, handled violent crime, but really spent the bulk of my time in the public corruption and financial crimes unit, handling cases where you had to very deliberately follow money to get to a perpetrator or the root cause of a problem. Additionally, I am a Navy intelligence officer. I am a reservist now, but I was deployed to Qatar and Afghanistan from July of 2017 until April of 2018. And my job over there was figuring out, where does the Taliban get its money from? And the reason we wanted to figure that out is so that we could attack those money sources so they couldn't buy weapons to attack us, to attack our troops. And it's those experiences and others that have led me to run for Cook County State's Attorney on a platform of first balancing and focusing our criminal justice reform efforts, getting after our gun crime epidemic by really disrupting the supply chain that brings all these guns here. And then third, just getting politics out of the state's attorney's office. And I look forward to our discussion and certainly want to thank the Players Coalition for having us and using your status as celebrities, frankly, to bring attention to everything that we're trying to do. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Donna Moore, and I was an assistant state's attorney and an assistant United States attorney. I was over in the felony trial courts at 26 in California, where I tried violent crimes, rapes, murders, armed robberies. And the issue when we talk about justice reform, which is on top of our minds, is how do you balance justice reform with keeping the public safe, with keeping our streets safe from some of the most dangerous among us? And how do you then make those determinations? You know, when you're in a felony trial courtroom and you have 350, 400 cases going through, you have to start to make those decisions. And I agree with Ms. Fox, we don't want to criminalize poverty. We don't want to keep people in Cook County Jail awaiting trial just because they can't afford a bond, and that's something that you actually have to evaluate case by case. But we also need, at the same time, to hold people accountable. Because if we don't hold somebody accountable, even for a low-level crime, then we have a sense of lawlessness. And that's what's happened in Chicago and Cook County. It's being reported on television, it's being reported in our newspapers. You have a 50% chance of getting away with murder. Murder actually increased in 2019 in some of our most troubled neighborhoods. And so that's where you have to balance criminal justice reform and still holding people accountable and making sure that our streets are safe. And what I hope to do is bring a better balance to our criminal justice system. Our justice system ought to be about fairness and about justice, and not about money and politics. And I'm the independent candidate in this race. Thank you. Can I just say one thing? I have these great glasses on, but I can't see the clock, just FYI. So, okay, that's fine. I can see close up, but I can't see that far. Sorry.
Get started with the first topic of the night, which is bond reform. When freedom depends on money, people still presumed innocent are locked up just because they are too poor to pay. In 2017, Chief Judge Evans issued General Order 188A, which requires that judges immediately cease the practice of setting unaffordable money bonds as a means of keeping people accused of crimes in jail pre-trial. However, there are still many people in Cook County Jail being held on unaffordable money bonds. What is your stance on the complete abolition of cash bail? Will you ensure more people are released pre-trial? If so, how? And what can we expect from you in the first 100 days in office towards ending cash bail? This is just a little bit of a loaded question.
Who do you direct that to?
So I'm directing it to every candidate.
Do you want to start? Who do you want us to go first? All right, I'll go ahead and go first. I figure we can go this way. Yeah. So what I think is most important is we need to remember the jail is a place for people that are a danger to the community. It is not a place for people that are poor. It's not a place for people that are addicted. It's not a place for people that are mentally ill. But yet for a long time, and still, we still send a lot of those folks to jail, and we shouldn't be. You know, there are, at the end of last year, there were 259 people in Cook County Jail who could be bonded out for less than $1,000. And even with, you have the humanity of that, and then additionally, it costs about $160 a night to house somebody. So that doesn't make any sense. And additionally, putting an addicted person in Cook County Jail does not make any sense. I mean, Cook County Jail, for those of you that have never visited, is such a worse place than the Illinois Department of Corrections. It is a terrible place, and a place that we don't want to send people if we don't have to. But yet, it is also the largest mental health clinic in the state and perhaps the country. And there's clearly something wrong in our society when that's the case. Now, getting to cash bail, it makes no sense to me that somebody who is wealthy can get out of jail while somebody who is not has to stay in. Therefore, I'm absolutely in favor of ending cash bail. And the determination should be, is the person a danger to the community or are they not?
So I worked on the issues of bail even before I took office. I was the chief of staff to the president of the county board. And what most people don't know, in Cook County, we have the largest single-site jail in the country. And that for almost 40 years, we were under a federal consent decree because of overcrowding. I remind people, I went to Cook County Jail back in 1988 on a Scared Straight program with my high school. It scared me straight into prosecution because I didn't want to be there. We literally had mattresses on the floor. The overcrowding was so egregious. We just got out of a federal consent decree within the last couple of years. In 2013, there were 10,500 people in that jail on any given day. The same people that Mr. Conway is talking about, addicted, those with mental health issues, and quite honestly, a huge population of poor people. When we talk about cash bail, we have to be honest with ourselves. It was that people were there because of their inability to pay, while dangerous people were allowed to be out. I remind people, Jason Van Dyke was charged with first-degree murder and was able to bond himself out of jail and awaited his trial for murder for 3 years, while there were people sitting in jail for retail theft who were sitting there for 6-7 months because they couldn't afford to get out. So some of the things that we did when I first came into office, we looked at offenses that we would say that we would recommend an I bond, a recognizance bond. Most of those cases were misdemeanors. We had a large population of homeless people who could not afford to pay to get out. And so we looked at every case, but we said, what are the offenses that we know pretrial detention doesn't make sense on? We went into court with the public defender and filed joint motions for those who could not afford a bond of $1,000 or less. The reality is, if your bond is $1,000, which means that you have to pay $100 to get out, it's not that you're a threat. Bond is not supposed to be oppressive. It's supposed to ensure that you come back to court and that you don't cause harm. And so those are some of the things that we've done. I will point out that the jail population, with Chief Judge Evans's order, has dropped to about 5,600. It's not perfect. We're still working on it. But I think we had to be honest that we were having dangerous people who were able to bond themselves out because they could afford it, and poor people who were sitting in simply because they could not.
You've heard there are two reasons for bail, or not for bail, which is to ensure that you come back to court, that you're not a flight risk, and to if you're a danger to the community. But one of the things that we've talked about is mental health. And you can't talk about the criminal justice system without talking about mental health. And one of the things that I've done a lot of work on is how can you stop, at the time of arrest, somebody who's mentally ill from going into Cook County Jail and instead going into a mental health facility that will get them the treatment they need, that will keep them on their meds, and that will get them to court at a cost less than Cook County Jail. And so that's something that I think we have to look at, because oftentimes what happens is somebody will go to Cook County Jail, they're off their meds, they're ill, and they commit a worse crime when they're in jail than the crime that got them there. So one of the things that I have looked at is, at the time of arrest, having a mental health professional, which is paid for by the cost difference in the cost of Cook County Jail versus the mental health facility, and making that determination so we're not sending folks who are mentally ill who shouldn't be in county jail, and instead can start to get treatment while their charges are pending and actually help them along the way. So that's one of the things that I would like to do to help solve the problem. The other thing is that a lot of times, and again, we don't want to criminalize poverty. Low-level nonviolent offenders should not be in jail merely because they can't bond out and somebody wealthy can. But part of the problem is that too often the Cook County State's Attorney's Office is kicking cases down the road. So in other words, instead of saying by agreement dates, which stop the Speedy Trial Act with the defense, we should be answering ready for trial. We should say, we have a case, we're ready for trial. And if the case gets continued and somebody is languishing in jail, even for a violent crime, then let that be on the defense lawyer. But we as the state have to do a better job of getting our cases to trial promptly so people aren't languishing in Cook County Jail.
And to answer your, believe in the abolition of cash bail. Cash bail does not keep us safe.
Second question?
No, that answer.
Okay. All right, let's move to police accountability and racial disparities. Trust in the Chicago Police Department for many in our Black and brown communities doesn't exist. We have a history of systemic racism, segregation, police misconduct, and very low clearance rate for violent crime. We are all aware of Jason Van Dyke fatally shooting Laquan McDonald. In addition, the Justice Department issued a report uncovering numerous additional incidents of officers using deadly force against individuals of color who were unarmed. In fact, the department used force 10 times more frequently against Black Chicagoans than white Chicagoans. Knowing this, what role will you play in prosecuting officers for misconduct? I'll take Ms. Moore.
I don't know if this. So nobody is above the law. I don't care white, black, or wearing navy blue. And that has to be something that everybody is aware of, right? The police department has to be aware of it. But we also have to restore public trust and public confidence, and that's what's happened right now. The public doesn't have confidence in the police department, in particular in Chicago, or in the state's attorney's office. You just have to talk to people to understand what the feeling is out on the street. So we both, state's attorney's office and the Chicago police, have to work to regain the confidence of the public. And we as the state's attorney have to make a commitment to the public that we will prosecute crime where we have the evidence. no matter what, white, black, or navy blue.
Yes, so when I was in the state's attorney's office, I had the opportunity to work with a lot of great law-abiding Chicago police officers. But that said, I also prosecuted three Chicago police officers while I was in the office. And, you know, it was a situation, and I'm sure these two have heard this story before, but one of them that was especially egregious was a case where a older gentleman with dementia had wandered into the house next door to his. He insisted the house was his, so they called the police. Police officer comes, walks the gentleman back to his home, and then over time befriended that older gentleman and put all his assets into his name. Obviously a very egregious case, and I remember when I got it, though, some of the senior state's attorneys said to me, hey, you start prosecuting the police, they're never going to work with you again. And I'll tell you what, I prosecuted that guy and convicted him, and after that I had many police officers come to me and say, hey, really appreciate you prosecuting, he was making us all look bad. And I say that story because I am not going to be afraid to prosecute officers that are not law-abiding police officers. I have done it in the past when it wasn't a high-profile thing, and of course won't be afraid to support law-abiding police as well.
I have prosecuted police officers for murder. Just in the first 2 months of my tenure, we've charged 2 police officers with first-degree murder. One of those officers was found guilty of second-degree murder in December of 2019, only the 3rd police officer to be found guilty of homicide. Today, we are in the beginning of a trial of a police officer, an Amtrak officer who shot and killed a man as he was trying to do a protective pat-down, who ran away from him, and the officer squared up and shot him in the back. I charged 2 police officers with murder within the first 2 months of my tenure. I believe you have to do that. I also think it's important that we acknowledge, and not in a cursory way, the harm and the break between the relationship between communities of color and the police. We have a federal consent decree. That didn't happen under my tenure. That didn't happen in the last couple of months, couple of years. The breakdown in communities has been happening over the course of decades. And if we don't have a realistic conversation about the relationship between communities of color and policing and accountability, and talk in platitudes and colorblind rhetoric, we're not going to do the hard work that it takes to be able to restore trust. Restoring trust isn't talking in slogans. It's owning the harm that has been caused, laying out a plan to be able to rectify that harm, and atoning for what has already happened. You cannot have reconciliation without truth, and you cannot have truth unless you acknowledge the harm that has been caused and do something about it. I hold police accountable, and for the good law-abiding officers who don't engage in those types of practices, we support them. But you have to be clear and unequivocal. If you break the law, we will hold you accountable, and I have done that.
I want to follow up on the theme that you guys mentioned, which was community trust, and I want to go back to Ms. Moore on this. How will you increase community trust and engagement to help bring people to justice who commit violent crimes?
Well, you have to be out in the community. You have to have your parents, your pastors, yes, law enforcement, and your prosecutors working together. Because as a prosecutor, you can't do it from the top. You have to start at the very grassroots level, at the community level. When we talk about justice reform, part of what we really need to be talking about is how do you reform the systems that are in place before people get into the criminal justice system. It's about keeping people out of the criminal justice system. It's about decades of failed social programs that haven't given kids the opportunity for education, people the opportunity for jobs and to better themselves economically, infrastructure in our communities that are economically depressed. That's part and parcel of what you have to do, what you have to advocate for as a state's attorney, even though it's not your job to do so. But part of the trust is to be out in the communities and let them know that you are there for them, not just to prosecute, but to actually help and to do things and to advocate for programs that will keep kids out of the justice system. as opposed to dealing with it once they get into the system. So I think that's a big part of how you start to restore trust, is to be out in the community and to be concerned about the community and let them see that you're more than just a prosecutor.
Mr. Conway?
Yeah. I am a big believer in community policing. I think it's a good thing that we have our new superintendent, Charlie Beck. You know, he was a real leader in Los Angeles of community policing. Of course, in the wake of Rodney King, Los Angeles tried to go the other way of locking everybody up. That didn't work. And then Charlie Beck was one of the people that really became a leader in community policing. And I'm excited that he is here as a leader of the Chicago Police Department to rebuild that trust with the community, because community policing really needs to become, in the Chicago Police Department, more of a, it needs to become a philosophy and not just some kind of program that it has been in the past. And with that in mind, it is also important that the prosecutor be someone who is out in the community as well. And that's why I'm going to make sure that I am someone that is, I know it's a big county, but is everywhere if I can be. And it will be when someone bravely comes forward to report a crime, you know, and they hopefully go to a police officer they know, at some point that person's going to get turned over to the state's attorney's office. And it would be great if they're saying, oh, those are the people that work for Bill. Or better yet, that's John, he works for Bill. And then in which case, and that's why I think it's important that the state's attorney's office, in addition to the Chicago Police Department and the suburban police departments, have a strong bond with the community.
Mrs. Black?
Yeah, we recognize that you have to be engaged with the communities that you serve. And so there are a number of initiatives that we've done. First was our Gun Crime Strategies Unit, where we took prosecutors out of the courtroom and placed them in some of our most violence-plagued neighborhoods to do a couple things. One, work with law enforcement to build strong cases, but also to get to know the neighbors who were reluctant to call the police, who were reluctant to engage. Part of the issue that we have is we have to, again, acknowledge the historical aspects of the relationship between policing and communities. Because I tell people, for example, the cases of Sergeant Watts, the police sergeant who shook down men and women in the Ida B. Wells housing projects. What happens with the Sergeant Watts, it's not just those people that he shook down, it's the people who live in that community who knew what was happening with Sergeant Watts, and now something happens, the last person they're calling is the police. So one is acknowledging the framework of which you're dealing with, being out and being engaged. So in addition to, you know, having our Gun Crime Strategies Unit, we have our Community Prosecution Bureau. We also have an outreach bureau that goes out, that is engaged with schools, that's engaged with CAPS meetings, that's engaged with community groups, again, before something happens. But I think for people to recognize that there is going to be change, again, we have to have honest conversations about where the break in the relationship is and to be able to atone for that. There's a reason that when we vacated the convictions of the Sergeant Watts victims, that I apologized. I apologized for that. I didn't convict these men. But for them to be able to believe that the system is atoning for what that looks like and for the people around them, that's what engenders trust. Where I grew up, you could show me better than you could tell me. Rhetoric is rhetoric. You have to, it's not just being, I go everywhere. It's part of the reason I talk about being from Cabrini all the time. One of the things that does is it allows people who live in marginalized communities to shout their buildings out to me. They see me, they know me. I know what it's like to hide in the bathtub from gunshots. I know what it's like to be afraid, to be able to go and cash your check from the currency exchange. I know what that looks like. And what those people want is somebody to be able to understand what that looks like and not prescribe militaristic tactics to fix it, not prescribe that it's a failing of systems around them. It's not social services that have failed. It's been the disinvestment in Black and brown communities. It has been the fact that we don't have mental health services available, that they closed the mental health clinics and people didn't stop being mentally ill. They just start putting them in jails and in hospitals. It's recognizing that economic disinvestment means that young people will engage in the only economy that is available to them. And so doing that and knowing those communities and what drives violence is how you start to heal, because in your prescription is different than jails. It is vacating convictions and moving records so that people can get jobs. and housing. Healthy, thriving communities have less violence, period. People in Lincoln Park are not better than people from Austin. But when I grew up in Cabrini, we had no resources. Our schools were some of the worst. We didn't have grocery stores. There is an iFly, an indoor skydiving place in the heart of where Cabrini used to be. That speaks volumes to me about where we put our investment. I don't think people shouldn't have a right to fake jump out of planes. If you have enough disposable income to pretend to jump out of a plane, good for you. But when I look at Austin, and I look at the scramble for fresh produce, when I look at the fact that they don't have an economy that people can legally participate in, and I see those people coming through our jails, that's what we need, those kinds of conversations, to bring and be a convener so that we can invest in real solutions to violence and not just give rhetoric to it.
Well, but some of the things that you're talking about, Kim, and I don't disagree with it, but some of the things you're talking about in terms of investment in our community are because our politicians have failed. Where are the aldermen? Where was, not this mayor, but prior administrations? Where was the county board? These are programs that should have been in place and that weren't in place. And now with the new marijuana tax, they're saying, well, now we're going to use that tax money to do programs in economically depressed areas and communities that need the help. The fact is that, again, before you get to the criminal justice system, there are a bunch of failed programs, and the politicians, not the state's attorney, but our politicians have failed us. So, I think we have to be clear on whose responsibility is what, and not that the state's attorney shouldn't be an advocate for that, but we have to be clear that we have years and decades of failed social programs in the communities that needed the most.
Not just failed social programs, again, an honest conversation. We had redlining. We had intentional racist institutional practices that have allowed for disinvestment in those communities. The need for social programs comes from the fact that we took resources out of neighborhoods and there were people who were then reliant on social programming. It's not just elected officials. This is a system that has been built on supremacy and oppression. And the people who have been the beneficiaries of that still live there. There's no way, it's not just elected officials, that in Cabrini, at Division and Larrabee, where I lived, that they didn't have groceries. But the moment you tear them down and fling people out into the community, then we can have a Whole Foods and a Jewel and a Mariano's in 3 blocks. That's not elected officials. That is a systemic history of racism in the city that has allowed for the tentacles of violence to perpetrate or permeate in Black and brown neighborhoods. And if we don't call it out, and we just say that some alderman or when I look at what's on the west side, when those neighborhoods were burned out in 1968, it's not that we can't hold people accountable, but if we don't own what the real issue is, we cannot fix it. We cannot root it out if we just blame people here and there. I'm sorry, I'm done.
I agree with much of what Ms. Fox said. I don't think I can say it quite as eloquently to your credit. But when Mayor Lightfoot was running for mayor, she often said on many occasions, we have to stop the economic cycle of disinvestment by getting after the violent crime. And if we want to get after the violent crime, we have to stop the economic cycle of disinvestment. And I think she's absolutely right. And she said that so often, I was volunteered on her campaign because I was so excited about the possibility of how those things work together. And I am excited to work with her as a partner on that as she has put forward her Invest Southwest plan to increase investment on the south and west sides of the city, which is very sorely needed. And we also need to get after the violent crime, and specifically the gun crime epidemic, and I look forward to working with her as a partner in that effort.
Thank you.
So we're going to move on to transparency and accountability. Until the public knows what a prosecutor's office does, we cannot hold them accountable. Across the country, we see prosecutors obscuring information about their policies and practices, even though they are elected They are elected officials and some of the most powerful people in the criminal legal system. We're going to discuss a couple of questions concerning the scorecard, how the community can know exactly what's going on. We're going to talk a little bit about how the Jussie Smollett case was handled, just for understanding transparency as part of this discussion. And then also campaign contributions and how that may affect the office going forward. So the first question I'm going to bring to Mrs. Fox: what lessons do you take from the public critique of the state's attorney's handling of the Smollett case?
You know, I think one of the biggest lessons is that people look to our office to be transparent and accountable, and we dropped the ball here. One of the things that I'm most proud of is that we were the first prosecutor's office in the entire country to make every piece of felony case level data available on an open data portal, not just for my tenure, but going back to 2011. Because again, I believe that people should be able to see your work. We are the most powerful actors in the criminal justice system. And so I believe people should see what cases are referred to us, who are we charging, what are their sentences, to be able to determine whether or not we're having racial disparities in every decision point that we've made. And in that case, this case was resolved outside of the eye of the public, who didn't understand or know what went into that. All they saw was there was a case and then there wasn't a case. And then there were questions. And so you can't trust the validity of the outcome if you don't see how it happened. And we didn't meet that standard, and I own that.
Yeah, well, first off, you had two major problems with that case. First is the brazen unequal justice. I had a client who was charged with the same thing, and I am happy to say that she graduated from a diversion program today, but it was a rigorous thing she had to go through. We went to court every month. She visited a probation officer every month. She had to pay significant restitution. She had to, when she wanted to leave Cook County, we had to go get permission of a judge to do this. And it took a tough 8 months for her to get through that, and I'm happy that she has. But the fact of the matter was, it was clearly a set of unequal justice that she was given. And the fact of the matter is, it happened because she's an hourly wage worker who didn't know anybody, and he is a politically connected celebrity. But additionally, what you had is the Ms. Fox told untruths to the public dozens of times on this case, most notably that he was treated the same way everyone else is treated. That was simply not accurate, as was pointed out not only by the judge in my case, but also the special prosecutor last week. And the Cook County State's Attorney needs to be a beacon of public trust if people are going to trust in the criminal justice system. And most people I talk to, based on the unequal justice issue and the integrity issue, think that as a result, Ms. Fox's reelection is disqualifying in that regard.
If I may, there are a couple of things. I'm never quite sure if you think the unequal justice is that your client shouldn't have had to do any of the things that you mentioned. And if that's the case, then it would seem that you believe that she should have not had to pay restitution, have not had to do the things, and had a guilty finding. The reality is that we have, and studies have shown, reduced the number of prosecutions that we've had across the board. There have been 5,000 less people who have been prosecuted in this office than under the previous administration for the same time period. And while it is tempting and sexy to point to the one of the 4,999 other cases to suggest that it was done differently, and also convenient that Mr. Conway doesn't mention that he read about his client in the newspaper, having not practiced law for a number of years, sought her out to represent her so that he could talk about her case and the unequal treatment that she's gotten, which not sure what the unequal treatment is. She doesn't have a guilty finding. She had to do conditions that could have been done if she didn't have her case in the first place. Now, I acknowledge, and again, own, that we have to be transparent in how we do our work. But every disorderly conduct case that this office has handled is available to the public to see. And that has been validated and looked at, not just by my office, but by academic institutions across the board. And so I do take personal affront to the notion, because I'm not clear of what we're getting at. You talk about the things that she had to do to not get a conviction. She doesn't have a conviction. correct?
Yeah, she does not have a
She does
conviction.
not have a conviction as part of a diversion program offered by our office, and somehow you feel that that's not fair to her.
It is not fair to her because
Okay.
he just paid money to have his case dismissed. He didn't have to go through all that stuff. And that's not right, considering his set of facts was far more egregious than hers.
You haven't told what her set of facts are.
The judge in the case said, this is a far more egregious set of facts, so I'm quoting the judge when I say that.
But you know what the set of facts are.
We're going to keep going. Donna, would you like to answer that question?
Thank you. So let's talk about, you know, as prosecutors, we need to deal with what we know, what the facts are. So what we know, you know, the good news about the Jussie case is that it focused everybody's attention on what the state's attorney's office is, because many people didn't know the difference between the state's attorney's office and the attorney general's office. So that's the good news about the case. But here's what we know. We know that there were charges brought, 16 felony counts, and then we know a few weeks later charges were dropped. We know that there have been text messages leaked, emails leaked, saying you can't just recuse yourself, you have to recuse the whole office, saying that there were calls from politically connected people asking if something could be done with the case. We also know that last week, Dan Webb had 2 charges that he was supposed to investigate. One was, should Jussie be re-indicted? And the second was there wrongdoing at the state's attorney's office? We know the answer to the first question because he came out last week and re-indicted Jussie Smollett in a 6-count indictment. So we know that the evidence was there. What we don't know, and what we still don't know today, was why the charges were dropped. And if Kim owns that, then why didn't she own it on March 17th or 18th last year when the charges were dropped? Why didn't she give a press conference and say, everybody, here's the case, here's what happened, here's why I dropped the charges? Now we have a special prosecutor, and now Ms. Fox says, I can't talk because the special prosecutor is investigating me, the result of which could be very, very serious. So the good news about Jussie was it focused attention on the office. Here's what the bad news is about that case. The bad news is that when you lie about a hate crime, in any community, in a minority community, Jewish community, Muslim community, gay community, when you lie about a hate crime, it makes it that much harder for another victim to come forward. It makes it that much harder for witnesses to come forward because people want to brush it off. It's like that other case where the guy lied. And that's the real disservice that Jussie did to all of our communities and to prosecuting hate crime. And that is the reason why the Smollett case is important and why we have to take lessons on how to handle those kinds of cases better and not to do things behind closed doors without the public knowing and without an explanation as to why those charges were dropped.
So, the second question we want to consider.
I'm going to go. Thanks.
I'm sorry.
You know, I don't know if there's anything else to say on this. Donna said some things that I said on the radio a few days ago in public forums. You know, you don't take a call early in the morning. You don't lie to the public or misrepresent to the public. And, you know, no matter which way, he was treated differently. I don't know about our young candidate's name, his client, but, you know, I look at what he did, and
I'm Bill Conway.
I know you are, but I think, you know what, it's funny,
I thought you had
because you know
Maybe
what,
you meant one of the-
he was outraged, and he ran down to help this woman reading an article. There's a lot of people that are falsely in prison that he should have been working on. She had a public defender. They were working on a deal. And I listened to the commercial. I go down every month with her and blah, 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 blah. And I'm really sick and tired of listening to the blah, 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 blah. Because you know what? We know both of them should have ended up the same way. Rich people are treated differently in the system because they get very rich attorneys, and they pay for them. We don't have enough public defenders, and we don't have enough state's attorneys. We don't have enough state's attorneys in the appellate division. There was an article out 2 weeks ago. It's about 730 days before the state's attorney starts filing their answers. Justice delayed by that is justice denied. I get calls often from people that have been in there several years asking for help, awaiting trial. Hopefully with the, as we move things along and we have true social justice, and I'm a civil rights attorney, we can be able to effectuate change in that system. Jesse Smollett, while it may define a legacy, unfortunately, of Kim Foxx on her ability to make a decision, and I think it was wrong, I hope it doesn't taint our whole system in the future. And that's why we need a new state's attorney. Thank you.
So the second question we want to go into is campaign contributions and corporate sponsorship of candidates. And there's been some critique, Bill, with potential, some of the potential donors that you've had. What is the responsibility of a candidate in an election and as a state's attorney when it comes to taking money from high-profile or corporate donors? How will you guarantee a truly independent state attorney's office?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So, you know, I assume that the basis of that is that my father and some folks at his firm have donated to my campaign.
Absolutely.
And so I unequivocally want to say I love my father. He's been a great father to me. But I never have worked at his firm. You know, I've dedicated the bulk of my career to public service, working at the state's attorney's office and serving in our military. And I can promise you that when I'm elected, I'm not going to owe anybody anything. And we know that there is a entrenched political machine here in Chicago, in Cook County. And when people get in office, they owe something to that machine. Well, I am fortunate that I will not owe anything to the machine, and that's why I can promise you and every voter in Cook County that I will be a truly independent state's attorney.
I got to jump in here.
1 second.
I got to jump in here.
I just have a follow-up. Sure. One could argue that as part of the machine is big corporate money. And so would you not owe people who have contributed to your campaign?
Well, I certainly would owe my father and my mom, who's in the audience, actually. I think we owe our parents our lives. And I can certainly promise you that if anything were to come up that involved my dad or my mom, hopefully not mom, but I can promise you that obviously I've recused myself. Now, it is worth noting my father has stepped down as head of his firm several years ago, and it's hard to imagine, and they're not in Chicago, so it's hard to imagine there ever being any kind of nexus between the state's attorney's office and my dad's firm. So I can actually promise you that it'd be exactly the opposite, that I'm not going to owe anything to anybody, and that's why I'll be able to maintain my independence, because I'm not reliant upon the corrupt political machine we have here in Cook County.
I got to jump in here because, again, I like to deal in facts. Mr. Conway has been a practicing lawyer for about 5 or 6 years. In the last 8 years, he has, in fact, worked for a company that his father owns. It's called Raputes, LLC, R-A-P-U-T-S, and he is the portfolio manager. So, you know, when we talk about pay to play, the Carlyle Group, his family's company, is the master of pay to play. They came into Illinois and they paid millions of dollars to the likes of Bill Cellini and Tony Rezko and Stuart Levine. And for those of you who don't know, all 3 of them are convicted felons and served time in prison. They were tried by the U.S. Attorney's Office. And he paid millions for pension funds.
Are you saying my father?
The company, the Carlyle Group, of which
Sure, none of these people were ever
your father wasn't indicted, no.
No, absolutely not.
So paid millions of dollars to these 3 to get pension fund money directed to the Carlyle Group to invest. They paid and the politicians played. And so when Mr. Conway sits up here and says that he is not part of pay to play and he is going to root out public corruption, That's a little bit hard to take sitting here because his family is the definition of coming into Illinois and paying our politicians off.
All right, we're gonna move on to gun violence.
You gotta let me respond to that.
After you respond, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. So I do manage, or now I put it aside, but manage a small portion of my father's money. It has nothing to do with his firm. Like I said, my dad's been a great father, but my mom here in the audience my parents were divorced when I was very young. My mom raised me as a single mom from when she was 5 years old, and she's been a great mom. And I've never worked at my father's firm. I don't know who the people are that you're talking about, and I can promise you that I'll be an independent state's attorney.
And if I may, just very quickly, I also, aside from all of the entanglements of the Carlyle Group and their investment in military equipment, including tear gas used at Ferguson, I'll leave that to the side for a moment. It is the frustration and I think the elitism that suggests that if you don't have someone to give you $8 million to put into your campaign, that somehow you are beholden to a machine. That is insulting to those of us who do not have billionaire fathers who can put money in our campaign. My father was a social worker. I grew up in the projects. I have to rely on people who believe and are inspired by the work that I'm doing in order to fund a campaign. So to suggest that money somehow gives you some disconnect or some level of integrity because you don't have to have others contribute to your campaign is an insult to the men and women who run for office who do not have ATMs attached to their parenthood.
All right, we're gonna move on. We're gonna move on.
You're not going to let me respond to that?
No, let's move on to gun violence.
Let's
move on. Go ahead, Corey.
We're going to move on to addressing gun violence. Violent crime and the gun violence epidemic continues to touch everyone in Cook County, including myself as a native Southsider. Examining creative, evidence-based solutions will be central to the conversation among candidates about how to reduce gun violence. What non-carceral approaches to addressing gun violence have worked, and what initiatives would you implement as state's attorney? Mr. Fioretti, would you like to start?
Well, I think coming into part of the program, and I'm sorry I was late, I'm going to do the same things as I was as alderman. I created 8,000 jobs. When I was elected, it was a 76% African-American ward. I was the first white person since 1915, and I won with 72% of the vote. Yes, we have disinvestment in our communities, and it's clear. I don't know, you can walk with me anytime. I've challenged any of the candidates to come with me through my old ward and see what happens with gun violence. Gun violence when I moved to the west side, now the West Loop, and even as a few weeks ago, we have gunshots happening all the time. I hear the sirens. I live right next to the hospitals, and it pains me every time. I hear each and every siren as they're bringing people into those hospitals. It's time for good people to stand up. And if we're not going to stand, and I'm going to tell you where we start standing up in our communities. We start telling the reverends who are all on the payrolls to tell their constituents because they know who's committing the crimes. They know who has the guns. They know when and where. I've had to fight a number of people and a number of gangs over and over to stop the flow of guns into our communities. We've got to be tough. People that are caught with just because you're for social justice doesn't mean you are opposed to making sure that we have sentences or we do deal with crime, the victims.
I'm sorry to cut you off. We have to.
So my question, we have to stand up. And I quite frankly, some of the candidates here I don't see have the ability to stand up to what's happening in our streets. Thank you.
Ms. Moore?
So, we've talked about a little bit of a common theme here tonight when we talk about violence, which is there's not one solution to gun violence. We actually have to go into our communities, again, at a very grassroots level, because we have to start with our parents, We have to start with our pastors and other religious leaders to be able to help understand that dispute resolution, I mean, that's what we're talking about. You don't like somebody, you have an argument with somebody, it's real easy to pull out a gun. So the questions are, let's look at the wait periods to get a gun, the kinds of records that you need to be able to purchase a gun. Yes, let's go into the communities and look at our parents and our pastors and see what can we do to help prevent the violence. On the other side, we have to make sure that it's safe for people to come forward. You know, part of what we heard and are hearing is that people are afraid to come forward. They're afraid to come forward to the police because they don't necessarily trust the police. They're afraid to come forward because we read in our newspapers that our witnesses are being killed, so they can't testify at a trial. So unfortunately, there's not one answer to how we stop gun violence. It's gonna have to be a multi-approach. We're gonna have to approach it in the communities. As a state's attorney, we're gonna have to do a better job of ensuring that the most violent and dangerous among us are held pre-trial so that our witnesses can come forward, so that we can get convictions, and so that we can get guns off the street. But it's not a simple answer, and it's not one solution.
You're about to say something.
No, go ahead.
Okay, great. Yeah, so to put some numbers behind our gun crime epidemic, last year in Los Angeles there were 254 murders. New York had 318. We here in Chicago had 492 murders. And murders are up, according to the Chicago Police Department, 43% so far this year. And the Chicago Police Department seized over 10,000 guns last year, far more than the just 7,000 guns they were seizing just 4 years ago. So I say if somebody commits a crime with a gun, I think that person should go to jail. But if we are really going to get after the gun crime epidemic that we have here, we need to work our way up the supply chain from the one person who commits a crime with an illegal gun up to the people that traffic in guns by the dozens and the hundreds. And we know that those are not people that are from our neighborhoods. In fact, I'll go one step further and say they're probably people that look a bit more like me and a little less like you all, for whatever that's worth. And additionally, we also though, to go hand in hand, we have to stop the cycles of economic disinvestment in our neighborhoods. Because if we're going to get after the gun crime epidemic, we have to stop that cycle of economic disinvestment, and those things certainly work together.
So I think you talk about non-carceral approaches, and I want to be clear, you know, it's not a militaristic approach that is going to solve gun violence in our communities. And while I know, you know, Mr. Conway wants to bring his expertise from fighting the Taliban, our neighborhoods are not occupying forces, and I know Ms. Moore has written an op-ed previously in the Tribune defending someone who was calling for the National Guard to be deployed to our neighborhoods. And I think it's rhetoric like that that is incredibly dangerous. The solutions to gun violence are multi-pronged, but it starts in communities. It is investment in those who have been impacted by the justice system and utilizing them and their expertise and knowledge in this dispute resolution. It is what people know as violence interrupters who know their communities, know conflict, and are deployed to do something about it. It is no small coincidence that as disinvestment in community resources happened as a result of the budget impasse under the previous governor, that violent crime went up. And that is because we didn't have the resources within communities to be engaged with those who were engaged in violent crime. The reality is, I just sat with a group of young people at the detention center the other day who have picked up guns, and these are not bad people. These are people who live in neighborhoods where they believe that their safety is dependent upon having a gun. And that is an environment that has existed in this city that we have to do something about, because it's not a luxury choice of whether or not they carry their piece. They believe that they need it to be safe. And so we have to create conditions by which people feel safe so they don't feel the need to pick up a gun. I use the example of Tyshawn Lee. Here's a 9-year-old boy who is lured off of a basketball court into an alley and shot in his head. And the reality is the trauma. My 9-year-old daughter, we live many miles away from where Tyshawn was murdered. My 9-year-old daughter couldn't sleep that night because she saw it on the news. Now imagine those children who sit next to that empty desk, that 4th grade empty desk, who know that Tyshawn was there, know that he was murdered. They don't have trauma services. They don't have anything to address what that looks like. It's easier for them to have someone on the street say, I got something so you're not caught slipping, than it is for them to get trauma services. So again, I think we have to stop talking about like good, bad, evil, good, and recognize that a lot of the people who are picking up guns in these neighborhoods have severe issues related to trauma, not just alternative dispute resolution. That's all they've seen. And you have high schools in this city where we have not one child who's died, not 2 children who've died, 3, 4, 5. And those kids who have to go to that school realistically believe that they have to protect themselves. That's real. And if we're going to talk about solutions, about why kids feel the need to pick it up, and also stop the supply, I agree, we need to stop the supply. But this tunnel vision about how we treat guns, Mr. Fioretti talked about a client that he had a few years ago who had to travel to urban prep through different neighborhoods whose grandmother said to him, I'm worried about you crossing gang lines. I need you to hold this. He got arrested. He committed a crime with a gun. He got on a bus with a gun. And this was a kid who had a promising future to get a scholarship to go to college. Under Mr. Conway's approach, he should be in prison. That's not creative, that's not thoughtful, and that's not recognizing the totality of the circumstances that we're dealing with here.
I wouldn't say that.
You can respond, and then I got another.
Okay,
You want to respond?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I have another question.
First of all, I would treat juveniles, you have to treat juveniles very differently.
He was
Certainly,
an adult.
I mean that with regard to
the age
adult.
of majority. He was an adult.
But I fundamentally believe that more illegal guns on our streets is a bad thing. I fundamentally believe that, and that's why I am passionate about this issue.
Okay. We have a couple of questions from the audience. This one is from Mr. Conway. Mr. Conway used to work for our previous state's attorney, Anita Alvarez. She was beaten by our incumbent, Kim Foxx, in 2016, mostly because Alvarez was too close to the FOP for cover-ups of police killings of young black and brown people and her role in getting false confessions through torture. In your view, what did Anita Alvarez do wrong, and what will you do differently?
Well, certainly she obviously waited way too long to prosecute Jason Van Dyke, and never really went before the public and said, hey, I've seen the video, it is egregious, it is something we need to do something about, and should have charged him much sooner. Additionally, everything that was done in terms of over-prosecution, that is clearly part of a bygone era, and I'm glad it is something that we are moving past, and it's something that I will continue to move past in my administration.
Okay, second question, and this one is for Mrs. Foxx. Jasper McLaren remains in prison 3 years after the Illinois Appellate Court threw out his gun possession conviction while Cook County prosecutors appeal his acquittal. The state's attorney's office routinely seeks extensions of 180 days or more to file responses and appeals. And what will you do and what resources do you need to expedite this process?
Yeah, Mr. Fioretti referenced it earlier. There was a report that came out about the delays in our justice system and the underfunding, both in the state's attorney's office and in public defender's office and the clerk's office related to appeals. Cook County is the only county in the state where the state's attorney's office handles their own appeals in-house. The rest of the state relies upon the Illinois appellate prosecutor's office to handle their appeals. Our appellate unit has shrunk. The reality is our office has shrunk over the course of the last several years. Appeals is one of the first assignments that people get into in the office. And so we have a lot of new young attorneys who go in and rotate throughout the office. We have grant funding for our appeals unit. We've went and applied for and gotten from the state additional resources for our appellate unit to be able to have more attorneys there, but we need more. And it's an all hands on deck issue for us where we have people who throughout the office who are writing briefs to try to be able to knock down that caseload. But it is a thing that I tell people, why we can't spend so much of our resources chasing nonviolent, low-level offenses that could be dealt with outside of the system, because we need our attorneys working on things like appeals. And when I say that the #1 referred prosecution in our office in 2016 was retail theft for felony, we still hold people accountable, but we're chasing people for these while people are sitting in prison because we don't have the bandwidth to be able to have enough attorneys to do that. And so it is a problem. We are working diligently to resolve it, and why we have to balance our priorities and stop doing things that aren't for the public safety but are in the interest of justice.
Can you say specifically what you're doing to resolve it?
So right now what we're doing is we've gotten additional resources, grant funding for more attorneys to hire. We're applying for more attorneys. At the same time, we are dispatching briefs to other people throughout the office to help us knock down the backload. But the reality is we had at one point almost 100 people in our appellate unit 7-8 years ago, and we're down to half of that. And so it is a funding issue. We don't have the resources to take out of violent crime prosecutions to put into our appellate unit. So those people who've graduated from appeals and are in our violent crime unit, they're prosecuting murders and writing appeals. And so we're triaging until we get the resources to fully fund our appellate unit where it needs to be.
But here, in answer to resources, part of it is that you have to use the resources that you have and you have to use them wisely. So under Ms. Fox, her prior head of the civil division, they cut the civil division, and he was referring cases back to his private law firm at twice the county rate. It's costing us taxpayers hundreds of thousands of dollars, and yet, again, resources that could have been used to hire additional assistants, and it wasn't. So when we talk about resources, when I was in the U.S. Attorney's Office, we used civil asset forfeitures that got us a couple times our budget. So we're not using what the state's attorney's office has to get funding to help some of these programs where we need it. We need to advocate before the Cook County Board to get funding. You know, Tom Dart, Sheriff Dart's hearing for his budget took hours and hours. The budget hearing for the Cook County State's Attorney's Office was done in less than an hour. So part of that is because of the connections of all the politicals in Cook County. But there are ways to get funding. There are ways to better utilize funds in the office, and we need to do a better job.
Well, but one thing, we do have a $150 million budget. We need about 30 more attorneys in the appellate division. If we can't find it, then something's wrong. My disagreement with what Donna just said, she should go over to many of the courtrooms over at the Daly Center where we deal with the forfeiture.
Yes.
I see it on a constant basis of forfeiture items. So it's there, it's happening. It's been happening for 40 years. I mean, you're not the first state's attorney who's taken property and going through a hearing. And I know that under some of the recent laws, there were changes as of a year ago, but the state's attorney is doing that job on forfeiture. It's getting the attorneys and looking at a $150 million budget and putting people and getting 30 more attorneys in that appellate division. I will do that when I'm state's attorney. Thank you.
I want to say the forfeiture piece, I think, is something worth addressing. If Ms. Moore is suggesting that we fund our budgets on the backs, we're not the U.S. Attorney's Office. We're not going after big corporate entities. That's not who we're forfeiting from. We're taking, and we worked with the ACLU to change the forfeiture laws here in Illinois because we were literally taking people's cars, their ability to get to and fro to work. We were literally padding a budget on the backs of poor people. And that's not how you fill budget gaps. You don't fill budget gaps by prosecuting people, criminalizing poverty to get fines and fees to be able to pay for your budget. I agree with you. We should be advocating for, and I have been able in the last 3 budgets to be able to increase our resources. But I would be wary of anyone who would suggest that we need to increase forfeiture in the Cook County State's Attorney's Office because primarily it comes for poor people of color.
No.
If You know, one way
You
I
need
think.
to go after the big drug dealers. That's what we're talking about. We're not talking about taking somebody's car.
That's right, but that's not what's happening. If it's been a while since you've been in the state's attorney's office, I recognize that. But those big-time drug dealers are not the ones who are fueling the forfeitures. We work with the U.S. Attorney's Office on a regular basis where they're putting together RICO cases to go after those big dealers to get those forfeitures. If you, like Mr. Fioretti said, come to see who it is that are the people who are subject to having their things forfeited, it is grandmothers who loan their car to someone and they get picked up with weed in their car and their cars were getting forfeited. That is not how we fill budget gaps on the backs of poor people.
When it comes to appeals, what we need to be doing is having the felony trial assistants have a greater role in the appeals from the cases that they handled. In fact, I had a bribery case. It was kind of a complicated one that ended up getting an appealed back when I was in the office. And the appellate brief was sent to me for review, and it was a complete disaster. And the reason it was, I knew it so intimately, is because I had actually tried the case and had to rewrite the entire appeal. And I think it will add a lot if those attorneys are involved in the appellate process earlier. And when it comes to the budget issues, the Cook County State's Attorney's Office does need to be doing much more when it comes to affirmative litigation. You know, at the federal level, what they have is a Federal False Claims Act that allows for whistleblower litigation. And the city of Chicago has one as well. But the Cook County does not have one. And what we need is an affirmative litigation piece within the civil division, and then the funds that are recovered from that come back to the state's attorney's office. But I agree with Ms. Fox when it comes to the civil asset forfeiture, because as for a long time that has been used has been frankly a racist process, and we don't want to keep emboldening that process of pure civil asset forfeiture.
Mr. Conway also doesn't
Sorry,
realize,
no, yeah.
we do have an affirmative litigation unit. We have sued Facebook, we have sued Uber, we have sued the opioid manufacturers for breaches of trust related to info that's been dispersed. So we actually have built out an affirmative litigation unit. I'll be glad to show it to you sometime.
We're going to move on, but I think it's important to point out that this is one of those issues where there was a lot of talk on this issue, but if any one of us has a loved one who is in jail
That's right.
and their case has been dropped, that's a problem. And you guys got to fix that.
That's right.
Let's move on.
So we got a couple questions from the audience before we move on.
Okay, this is addressed to everyone. The number of homicides in Chicago has gone down for 3 years. To what do you attribute this?
I think 2016 was a horrific year. It was an outlier year. We had over 760 people murdered, 4,000 people shot, and it was not indicative of where we were before. As I mentioned earlier, it was also in the height of a budget stalemate and the deprivation of resources to deal with violence on the ground level. In the years since, there have been innovative approaches been taken by the Chicago Police Department. There has been a re-engagement in the community on the community-based level with organizations on the ground like Chicago Ready, like Heartland Alliance, and others who've taken a more holistic approach and involved communities in being the resolution. We have been grateful to work with these partners with our Gun Crime Strategies Unit, but it has been truly an all hands on deck. And I think that is what is unique about Chicago in the last couple of years is the coming together of the philanthropic community, the law enforcement community, and community-based organizations to work on this together. There has not been this finger-pointing, fear-mongering that I hear so often articulated on this stage about who's responsible. We also know that violent crime goes in waves, that sometimes it just happens because this is where we are in the cycle. But I'm very proud of the work that the city as a collective has done working together to address violent crime, and that's what I can attribute to some of the reduction.
Well, I talked about the numbers earlier in the sense that Chicago, we had 492 homicides last year, which is a number that is higher than it was in 2015, while Los Angeles and New York have enjoyed roughly 10% decreases since then. And if we're going to really get after the gun crime epidemic we have here, I really think we need to focus strongly on getting after the supply chain that brings all these weapons here, because that is what's really going to bring about the reduction. And instead, what we have is 10,000 guns being seized a year versus just 7,000 merely 4 years ago. And would, of course, add that homicides are way up, or murders rather, are way up this year. So it is something that we have to be strong about getting after the gun crime epidemic that we have.
I think, again, last year, murders were actually up by a third in our toughest neighborhoods. So yes, the overall murder rate went from the high back in 2016 to just under 500 this past year, but that's still an unacceptable number. There's still too many of our kids who are getting killed on the streets. And so, yeah, listen to the Chicago police who have said in certain areas they've deployed more police officers. They've had help from the Cook County sheriffs. They have cleared a lot of murder cases, which the state's attorney's office has in charge. But I do think it's an all-hands-on solution. We've talked about it up here. It's not just one entity. It's not the police. It's not the state's attorneys. And we need cooperation of everybody if we're going to continue to see a reduction, a substantial reduction in our murder rate, because 500 murders a year is still an unacceptable number in my mind.
Well, I think a single murder is unacceptable. In 2008, a young man by the name of Reuben Ivy was killed outside of Crane High School. We then, the attendance rate was about 70%. It went down to about 30 at that time. What we did was we flooded the area with social services, wraparound services. We brought people together. We created Operation Safe Passage, and I was the architect of that, which we now have at many of our schools. And I say that because what happened there, people did it for we brought priests, parents, and the police together to make sure our kids were safe. You know, I've advocated for 1,000 more police officers, and I voted against several budgets because they didn't include it. But when you look at police officers, we can't put military into our communities. We have to have people from our communities. And I was always an advocate for diversity in our police force. And I got several of our aldermen, even those that are currently still there, criticized me for it. When we created Operation Safe Passage, my picture was in the paper walking some of the kids to school. And I got a call from one of the current aldermen, and he said, "It's now our business to start walking kids to school?" I said, "Yes." You know, we need to bring jobs, we need to bring economic opportunity into every neighborhood. And we can do that if we have a will. You know, the state's attorney's offices can't do everything, but we can advocate, like I did, job fairs for veterans, ex-offenders, and people in my community. And I'll do that throughout the whole of the city and the county when I'm state's attorney.
We have another question from the community.
Yeah, another audience question. State's Attorney Kim Foxx has decided to charge those accused of retail theft of an item valued under $1,000 with a misdemeanor, that you spoke of earlier, instead of as a felony. Is there any evidence that this policy has increased instances of retail theft, and what effect has this change had on mass incarcerations?
Most people don't know this. Illinois has one of the lowest felony retail theft thresholds in the country. $300 is our retail theft threshold for a felony. Now, it doesn't mean that if you steal something that's $2.99, you're not held accountable. You're charged as a misdemeanor. Misdemeanor allows you to be able to be, if you were incarcerated, of up to a year, but also allows for probation. 47 other states have a higher felony retail theft threshold than Illinois does. And so when Mr. Conway is right, when we look at places like Los Angeles and New York, who do not have the gun violence, the homicide rate that we have, they also have a substantially higher retail theft threshold. They are not, the uniqueness of Chicago, of Illinois, isn't that we have more thieves, it's that our threshold is so low. And so that's why we've reprioritized our resources. There has been a study by the Pew Research Institute that has found that in other jurisdictions across the country that have raised their retail theft thresholds, that crime has not risen. Now, we are looking at retail theft and making sure that, again, that people are being held accountable. What we've seen is a decrease in the Illinois state population, or prison population, a decrease of 20%. And SPAC, the group that looks at numbers in the jail or the prisons, have attributed that to a decrease in the number of people who are going to prison for retail theft. Now, I think the rhetoric around this has turned from people stealing from stores to roving bands of people knocking people down, which is not a retail theft, that is a robbery. But the conflation to scare people has been mind-blowing. The fact of the matter is, if we've seen a 20% reduction in our prison population for people who were cycling in and out of prison for retail theft, not for 2 years, not for 3 years, they were going for 6 months. They were going for months. We were literally incarcerating people, taking them from their families for these offenses for months at a time. If they were a true threat to public safety, we wouldn't send them down there for 6 months or 3 months. The dramatic drop in the prison population in Illinois is a result of our changing of our retail theft policy. And I believe that people should go to prison if they are a threat to public safety, and that we can find solutions like charging these cases as misdemeanors and still hold people accountable without having a disruption to people's communities by having more people incarcerated needlessly.
Thank you. We're going to move on to closing statements now. Mr. Fioretti, would you like to start us off?
How long?
2 minutes.
Thank you, everybody, and thanks for coming out tonight. I am a little dry, and so sometimes I raise my voice, but I do want to thank everybody. I think this is an important race. You know, again, we are dealing with our criminal justice system. But the state's attorney's office, or the perception is of the criminal justice system. But the truth of the matter is, it takes in 25,000 civil cases a year, tax appeals. It's much more broader than just dealing with the criminal justice system. We need to have people with integrity there, with a judgment. Yes, the Jussie Smollett case bears heavily on this race. We can't forget that. But at the same time, we have to look at what we can do to make sure that we're advocates for those that are in jail. As I said, when we file that criminal complaint, we represent the defendant, we represent the victim, we represent law enforcement. If we don't have the right combination of people in that office to set the tone, to set what should be done, we will all suffer. Thank you very much.
We'll just go down the road?
Yes.
Okay. So I'll end where I began, which is this race for our top prosecutor should be about justice and fairness and not about politics and money. I'm raising money the old-fashioned way with $5 here, $500 there. I don't have a machine behind me that feeds me money. I don't have an ATM. My dad's up there and he hasn't been dribbling money down for me. But it's important because that's how it's supposed to be, right? We're not supposed to only be able to choose from people to elect a top prosecutor from someone who's a machine candidate or someone who has billions of dollars to run for office. Haven't we had enough? We see every week our public officials are being indicted. Some are being indicted because they're bribing each other. And isn't it time that we as voters say, enough is enough? Let's elect somebody to be the top prosecutor who's actually prosecuted violent crime, rapes and murders and armed robberies. Why are we so willing to accept less qualifications from somebody because we elect them? You wouldn't hire a lawyer that didn't have background and experience, so why are we willing to elect someone? So to me, this office is something I'm passionate about. I've spent 30 years being an advocate, both as a prosecutor and in my private practice. I've gotten 3 young men pardoned who I thought were wronged by the system. So, you know, the system isn't perfect. And just because you're a prosecutor, it doesn't mean that as Bob said, you help everybody in that system because as the top prosecutor, you're responsible for that. But let's as voters finally say, we're sick and tired of the party telling us who to vote for or only having candidates that can self-fund. Let's elect someone that is responsible to us, the voters. And that's what I will do as your state's attorney.
What we need to do if we're going to have real criminal justice reform is we need to fundamentally change the way we think about drug crime. Drug crime is about 40% of the criminal justice, of the felonies charged in Cook County. And about 60 to 70% of those are possession cases. And we need to be getting the people that are charged with drug possession into treatment quickly. We need to be thinking about drug possession as much more of a public health problem than something that we can handle in the criminal justice system. I mean, by that same token, however, there are still places in this city and in this county where drug dealers will hand out free samples the day before payday. Then we have to prosecute the hell out of. But the people that drug possession, that is something, there are far, far, far more drug possession cases in Cook County than there are retail theft, for example. So that is something that we have to fundamentally change the way, if we are going to change the way we are going to have real criminal justice reform here going forward. And I want to thank the Players Coalition for using your platform to bring, to shine a light on all the issues that we talked about today. Thank you for having us.
You know, I've worked over the last 3 years to implement a progressive agenda for the criminal justice system here in Cook County. I am a proven progressive leader. I don't just play one on TV. I think it's important for us to recognize that when I took office in 2016, we were known as the false confession capital of the United States. We have gone from being the symbol of wrongful convictions to leading the country over the last 2 years in the vacating of wrongful convictions. To date, over 100 men and women have had their convictions vacated just in the last 3 years. When I took office in 2016, again, we weren't going after violent crime in neighborhoods that saw so many people of color shot down in our streets. We spent more of our resources chasing low-level retail theft folks than we were putting them towards guns, violent crime, and homicides. That we were prosecuting hand over fist people who were driving for suspended licenses for their inability to pay tickets. And we stopped that practice in 2017 when it was vastly unpopular. And then the city of Chicago in 2019 passed an ordinance that said they would stop suspending licenses. And Governor Pritzker just signed the License to Drive Act in January that will give 55,000 people their driver's licenses back. All of those people are poor. The fact of the matter is that I've worked on the marijuana legalization bill. We have one of the most socially justice, equitable bills in the country that before we sold the first gummy, joint, brownie, we were making it right for the people who had previous convictions by vacating their convictions. And I went into court myself to vacate the first 1,000. And what I will tell you is that when people were up in arms about this office, there was a press conference that people like to tout, where there were certain police chiefs who were there who said they didn't care about Jussie Smollett. And what I know is that it hold me accountable. But for every time that I go to a neighborhood where people don't have the homicide cleared, that their sons or daughters' murderer is still out there, and they hear about the $135,000 that was spent trying to prove that Jussie wasn't a victim, but they couldn't get a phone call to tell them what happened to their son, they're frustrated. And what I know for a fact is that we as a system owe it to those communities to do better by them. It is not of a surprise that the legacy that which Mr. Fioretti thinks that I will be held to will be this one case. It is to the benefit of the people on this stage for us to focus on that. The totality of my record shows that the people who I have went to the mat for on every policy related to making sure there's fairness, justice, and equity were people whose names I'll never know, who come from neighborhoods that resembled mine, who were poor and disconnected, marginalized communities who will be able to have their lives given back when those convictions are vacated and have their driver's licenses back, or the 5,000 less people who were prosecuted. They weren't politically connected. They were men and women
who live in some of our most impacted neighborhoods, who are grateful for the opportunity to have a second chance. And so what I say to all of you, the record that I've been able to establish over the last 3 years isn't a record about privilege and power. It's actually quite the opposite. Those police chiefs who spoke, who said that this wasn't about Jussie, and I'm certain they found the tape. They said this was about the fact that they were angry that I wasn't prosecuting marijuana. Well, we're not, now it's legal. They were angry that I wasn't prosecuting people for driving on a suspended license. I wasn't, and now they're not doing that anymore. And they were angry that I was pushing for bond reform. And guess what? I still am. And so I'm proud of my record. I'm proud of the work that we're doing. And as Mr. Conway alluded to, I've been talking about the fact of the 40% of our cases that are drug cases and convened a commission to come together to work on how to address that in my next term. So I'm grateful for the validation of the efforts that we've been making in that realm, and we'll continue to do the work to keep our communities safe.
Let's give all of our candidates another round of applause. This concludes our 2020 State's Attorney conversation. Thank you for everyone for joining us tonight. Election Day is Tuesday, March 17th. Early voting starts March 2nd. Thank you to all of our candidates and everyone for coming out tonight. Have a good night. Thank you.